I remember that morning far too clearly. The kind of January cold in Denver that dries the air so much, every breath feels like it slices straight into your lungs. I stepped out of the elevator on the 55th floor of Marston Aerotech, adjusted my coat, and told myself this meeting was just another routine briefing. But the silence in the hallway said otherwise. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come from professionalism. It was the kind that comes right before something explodes. The conference room on 55 had always been the company's trophy. It looked more like a showroom than a place people actually met. The table was solid Italian walnut, so long that if you stood at one end and apologized, the person at the other end wouldn't hear it. Floor to ceiling glass looked out over Denver, and farther out, the Rockies were buried in snow. Overhead hung a chandelier that cost half my annual salary. Everything in this room existed to make one point very clear. This was someone's empire, and that empire was waiting for me inside. Grant Marston was already at the head of the table, 61, gray at the temples, with a square jaw that always went red the moment he got angry. I had spent 13 years of my career under a man who loved power so much that every decision he made felt like theater. When I walked in, he was fixing his tie. Once, then twice, then a third time. The movement was so tense it almost looked like he was subconsciously trying to choke himself calm. But he wasn't what made me stop short. Sienna Marston was sitting in my seat, leg crossed, cream blazer perfectly pressed, lips painted a dark wine red. Sienna, 31, Grant's adopted daughter. Excellent on camera, excellent at giving conference speeches, excellent at pretending she understood everything. But in the real world of aerospace supply chains, she was someone trying to read a map she had accidentally turned upside down. And now she was sitting exactly where I should be, next to my laptop, above the documents I had prepared all week. I pulled another chair and sat down. No one spoke. No one even looked directly at me. The air wasn't just tense. It felt like a courtroom seconds before a verdict. Grant broke the silence first. His voice was low, but there was a contained satisfaction underneath it. Claire, thank you for being on time. I'll get straight to the point. The board reviewed the recent safety reports. There is a serious FAA inspection protocol violation under your area of responsibility. I held his gaze. 13 years handling crises, 13 years standing in defense supply chains. I knew exactly how serious the FAA could be. I also knew exactly who suggested cutting inspection steps to meet delivery deadlines. And that person was sitting right next to him with her legs crossed. I calmly asked where the violation occurred. Grant placed both hands on the table, as if preparing to shove someone off a ship deck. No need for details. The decision has been made, effective immediately. You have 5 minutes to collect your things and return your badge to security. 5 minutes. It took me exactly four to understand this wasn't a sudden shock. It was a plan. One laid out in advance. I didn't ask anything else, didn't protest. The thing people like them fear the most is calm. I smiled, a small tilt of my mouth like someone had offered me a cup of tea I didn't particularly like. 5 minutes. The most polite 5 minutes of my life, I said. Sienna raised an eyebrow, maybe confused why I wasn't panicking the way she expected. Grant tugged at his tie again. Harder this time. I even heard a tight little exhale escape him. I stood, opened my bag, and gathered the few things left on the table. My leather notebook was filled with transport chain notes, the blue pen I had used for 8 years, and the project file I had submitted just last week. No one spoke. The only sounds were papers shifting and the ticking wall clock counting down my so-called career. As I walked toward the door, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the hallway. My team was standing frozen. Linda, who had worked in logistics longer than I had been a mother. Raphael, the tech who always called his mom during lunch from Mexico City. And Nora, our supply chain safety lead, is holding a meeting packet with confusion written all over her face. The entire floor felt still. No one knew what was happening, but everyone could sense something was very wrong. I walked forward steadily, never looking back. Behind me, Grant was counting under his breath, like someone timing leftovers in a microwave. With every step I took, the fog in my coworkers' minds seemed to lift, revealing the truth that today wasn't just another meeting. At the end of the hallway, I paused. I didn't look back at the conference room. I looked out at Denver through the glass, the morning light bouncing off buildings dusted in snow. A wide city, a place with more possibilities than a fancy room where people were willing to crush integrity to protect ambition. There is still so much more I need to tell you. But before I go on, I want to know which city you are listening from. I would bet that anywhere in this country, there is at least one workplace story so absurd that no one would believe it. Where are you, and have you ever seen something like this? If you answer, I promise the next part goes even deeper. 3 weeks before the morning, I was given 5 minutes to pack up my life. Things in Glendale were still calm in the way people often assume calm will last forever. Glendale sits far enough from Denver to escape the noise, but close enough that I could drive to the office in under 20 minutes. My house was small, one story, sloped roof, with an old maple tree out front that turned the entire yard crimson every fall, like someone had rolled out a carpet on purpose. I lived there with my younger sister Rachel, who had spent almost half her life learning how to live with rheumatoid arthritis. On the mornings when Rachel could get up without needing me to open her pill bottle, those were good mornings. I usually heard her moving slowly down the hallway while I made coffee. I'm not the type who brings work home, but one look at Rachel trying to hide her pain behind a joke was enough to remind me that my job wasn't just a job anymore. It was the thing keeping our lives steady. Her peace was the reason I was willing to manage thousands of tiny details every day, from military equipment manifests to tangled transport schedules. People like to think aerospace is all about pilots or commercial flights. In reality, most of Marston Aerotech's survival came from military transport missions no one outside the industry ever saw. My job was to make sure everything from radar systems to aircraft components to sensitive cargo moved on the right path, at the right hour, under the right FAA standards. I kept my eyes on every payload, every route, every clearance code. One tiny deviation could hand $100 million contract straight to a competitor. I used to think staying invisible was simply part of the job. People praised pilots and generals, and I was content being the person in the shadows. But 3 years ago, when I designed the Green Line routing system, everything shifted. The design wasn't flashy, just hundreds of pages of optimized routes, layered charts, and dense safety metrics. But the system saved the company $120 million. That number thrilled the shareholders, and Grant, our CEO, acted like he had personally invented it. Just when Greenline went live across all defense contracts, Sienna started appearing more often in meetings. At first, I thought she was there as a formality. She was Grant's adopted daughter, 31, polished, charming, perfect for glossy business magazines. One morning, she walked into my office with expensive perfume trailing behind her and a smile wide enough for a magazine cover. She said she wanted to learn, to understand the supply chain, to have me guide her. And I believed her. Or at least, I wanted to. I showed her transport maps, explained weight limits, and explained why the FAA is never an agency you want to upset. She nodded, grateful and eager. But a few weeks later, the person leading conversations with partners was suddenly Sienna, and I was pushed back to the technical seat. The press called her the new leadership face. They had no idea she had asked me the week before whether the FA really needed to check things that thoroughly. She always knew how to step where the spotlight fell. I was busy handling the places it never reached. And then came Fort Carson. Fort Carson was a $200 million contract with a military base in Colorado Springs. The transport run seemed routine until I spotted a discrepancy in the landing time data. Being off by a single hour meant the FAA could hold the entire shipment. That would delay everything by 3 days, trigger contract penalties, and likely eliminate Marston from future defense bids. No one knew that, except me. While Sienna posted photos from a conference in Chicago, I sat alone at my home desk, calling Dallas, rerouting paths, coordinating with Fort Carson, and updating payloads. Rachel passed by a few times, worry in her eyes, though she tried not to ask. By sunrise, everything was fixed. The shipment landed exactly on time. No one knew we had almost lost the contract. 2 days later, during the full leadership meeting, I sat near the back with the detailed report in hand. On the screen, the first slide appeared. Sienna, standing beside a large cargo unit with the caption, Fort Carson Transport Initiative. Grant stood proudly at the front, talking about how Sienna had overseen the route to ensure optimization. Not one word about the system error I caught. Not one word about the night I spent fixing it. I said nothing. Sienna glanced at me from the podium. Her look wasn't grateful. It was a quiet message that she had moved a step ahead in the game. I left the meeting while people were still buzzing about the rising star. I wasn't angry, not even bitter, the way some might expect. I had simply understood something that sounded simple, but carried weight. In a company where the story belongs to the person who stands in front of the crowd, the one who fixes the mess will always stand behind it. Not because they're lesser, but because leadership doesn't want them in the frame when the cameras appear. When I got home that day, Rachel was sitting on the armchair, legs propped up on a soft cushion, a worn book in her hands. She looked up and smiled. Rough day, sis. I laughed quietly. Rough in the way only this company can define it. She understood immediately, even though I didn't explain more. Watching Rachel, that calm made something crystal clear. I couldn't let my life be shaped by people who stole credit as easily as they breathed. I didn't know things would collapse as quickly as they did, but I could feel something shifting under my feet, quiet but powerful, like the runway trembling just before an aircraft lifts into the air. And that was the beginning of everything that came next. I always believed cracks at work never appear suddenly. They start with tiny shifts, small enough for people to ignore but stubborn enough to pull the entire system in a different direction. For me, the seed of betrayal began on a morning that looked perfectly ordinary. That day, just as I set my coffee down, Sienna appeared with her usual brand of confidence. She stood at my office door, arms full of freshly printed papers. Claire, I need to discuss something important. The way she emphasized the word important told me I was about to walk into a conversation where one person felt brilliant and the other would end up cleaning the mess. Sienna pulled out a chair, sat across from me, and opened the stack like she was unveiling a solution that would save the world. I think we should shorten the FA inspection process. Clients say we take too long. If we cut a few small steps, things will be more flexible. I put my pen down and looked straight at her. She had worked here for 3 years, but the way she talked about the FAA made me wonder if she understood what she was proposing. I asked her which steps she meant. She answered instantly, too casually. The cross-checks. The procedures like verifying weight loads or reviewing system logs. I don't think they're necessary if we trust our transport team. I needed a second not to laugh. Sienna thought the FAA was a scout club. She forgot it was the agency that could shut down an entire airport if we were off by a single mark in a report. I spoke slowly, one word at a time. This is not a field for improvising. Cutting steps means putting our heads into a grinder. She frowned, not because she understood the risk, but because my words interrupted her enthusiasm. She gave a few more arguments that sounded like leadership quotes pulled from a business book, then stopped when she realized I wasn't buying any of it. In the end, she left looking annoyed, as if the company were stagnating solely because of me. 2 days later, the executive board held an internal meeting to review Sienna's proposal. I arrived early and sat at the corner of the table, like always. When Sienna presented, eyes bright with excitement, I noticed Harold Kepler from the board leaning slightly toward her. Harold loved saying that a company must be bold to grow. To him, bold always meant going faster at any cost. Harold nodded nonstop. The moment Sienna mentioned improving delivery speed, he jumped in. Excellent idea. We need young thinking. He never asked which procedures were being cut, never asked what the FAA required, never asked about the risks. His shares seemed to do the talking for him. When it was my turn, I said the simplest truth. There is no safe way to cut FA procedures. And if we try, it won't take hours for them to catch us. Harold looked at me like I had personally declared war on human progress. Claire, sometimes you're too cautious. Leaders have to lead. I didn't respond. When money points in a direction, logic loses value. The meeting ended with a vague conclusion to study the proposal further. That alone told me the wind was starting to shift. That afternoon, while I was reviewing next week's flight schedule, an email appeared in my inbox with a generic subject line. I opened it without thinking. But by the second line, I knew it wasn't meant for me. It was written to Grant. Sienna claimed I was becoming an obstacle to the company's new direction. The department needed a younger leadership image to match the market. My insistence on FAA compliance was costing opportunities, and she suggested moving me into an advisory role to make room for a fresh strategy. No need to guess. This was how Sienna cleared her runway. She didn't need to be skilled. She only needed to tell the right story to the right person at the right moment. I read the email again. Not angry, not even surprised, just a strange quiet, the kind that follows an explosion, when every sound disappears and all you hear is your heartbeat. I got up, locked my office door, and pulled the backup drive from my cabinet. People in my line of work always keep backups. Experience had taught me that not everyone plays fair in environments like this. I plugged in the drive, checking every file, every folder. I saved the reports related to Fort Carson, saved the entire internal conversation about cutting procedures, saved Sienna's misdirected email. Everything went into one folder. I named it something discreet but unmistakable to me. Read if you don't want to forget. When I stepped out of my office at the end of the day, the Denver sky had turned a soft violet. I saw my reflection in the hallway glass. I looked ordinary, like someone finishing a shift and thinking about dinner. But inside, everything had changed. Not because I felt threatened, but because I finally understood something with absolute clarity. Betrayal doesn't come from people who dislike you. It comes from the ones who smile and call you sister. I left the building with a strange feeling, as if a door had just closed behind me, and the click of the lock wasn't mine. I just didn't know yet that the door would lead straight to the morning when I'd be given 5 minutes to leave the company. I walked out of the 55th floor conference room feeling like I had just escaped a performance I never signed up for. Sienna was still sitting in my chair, and Grant stood behind me as if he had just finished a theatrical execution. When the heavy door closed, the metallic click sounded exactly like the ending he wanted. I stepped into the elevator and pressed 18. The numbers dropped so slowly that I had enough time to think about my 6 years at Marston Aerotech. 6 years wiped away by a termination notice citing violation of FAA inspection protocol, something Sienna couldn't even distinguish from a commercial flight safety card. When the elevator opened, operations was silent in the most unnatural way. It was usually the loudest floor in the building, full of keystrokes and rapid-fire logistics conversations. Today, everything was still, as if someone had hit pause. I took a few steps, and dozens of eyes turned toward me. No questions, no whispers. Just that strange quiet you hear from people who know something big has happened but can't quite believe it. Linda was the first to stand. She had been here longer than I had even imagined myself lasting in aerospace. Her hair was softly gray, her hand always wrapped around the same red pen like it were part of her body. She placed the pen on the desk, a tiny gesture but loud enough for the entire floor to hear. Then she looked at me with an expression both sad and resolute. I shook my head slightly, telling her to sit. But Linda said, clear and steady, I don't work for people who disregard safety. She walked to my side without hesitation. My throat tightened. Raphael stood next, the young technician who called his mother in Spanish every lunch break. He removed his badge, walked straight to Sienna's desk, where she sat frozen, and set it down in front of her. No harsh slam, but it felt like a gavel hitting the conscience of the room. Sienna recoiled, eyes wide, as if it had never occurred to her that this could go beyond her control. Then the first laptop snapped shut, a sharp cack, then a second, then a third. Within 10 seconds, the whole floor echoed with a chorus of final decisions. I used to think historic moments only happened in movies. Turns out they show up the moment people finally stand where they should. The sixth person rose, then the 14th. No talking, no planning, just instinct guiding feet toward the elevator. I looked at them, every familiar face I had worked beside. The one who once slept on a chair after a crisis shift. The one who cried from pressure but came back the next morning. The one who emailed at midnight to double-check a military shipment. They weren't walking out because I had been fired. They walked out because if someone like me could be kicked out for refusing to violate FAA protocol, then any of them could be next. Linda leaned toward me and whispered, "If they plan to replace you, they should at least keep one person who knows how to check cargo pressure correctly." I let out a soft laugh. Not joyful, but painfully true. Sienna nearly ran out of the office, her voice shaking. "You can't just leave like this. This is impulsive." Raphael turned back. More impulsive than firing the only person who knows what's flying into Fort Carson. Sienna went silent. Grant arrived just as 20 people were lined up at the elevator. He was out of breath, either from running down 55 floors or from the panic swallowing him. His suit was crooked, his tie bent, his face red as if it might burst. He tried calling out names, voice cracking as he tried to sound authoritative. No one turned around. When he shouted, "Come back to work now," the silence from the entire floor answered for all of us. He turned to me. "Claire, you have to stop them." I met his eyes. "I don't control them. I just did my job. They're doing theirs." In that moment, Grant no longer looked like a billionaire CEO. He looked like a man who had just lost the last of his power and didn't understand how it slipped away. Sienna stood behind him, pale, gripping her phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack. When our group stepped into the elevator, no one spoke. 20 people behind me, each carrying a decision made in minutes, but I knew these were the truest minutes of their careers. Down in the lobby, the security guard straightened immediately. Tom, the one who often brought me coffee during crisis nights, simply nodded. A simple nod, but full of the respect Grant could never buy. The glass doors opened. Denver's cold wind hit my face, sharp, but cleaner than the air inside that polished conference room. I walked out, the steady footsteps of 20 people behind me. Not chaos, not rebellion, just the sound of people who finally knew their worth. I didn't know where the future would take me, but as I looked back at the doors of Marston Aerotech closing behind us, one thing was unmistakably clear. My life had just stepped into a new chapter, and I wasn't walking into it alone. I drove out of the Marston Aerotech parking lot feeling like I had been pulled out of a familiar coordinate. The road back to Glendale was usually simple, but this morning it stretched out like a runway with no endpoint. I tried to hold back the tears, but that was harder than coordinating a military shipment across 3 states in 6 hours. Eventually, the tears came anyway, quiet and stubborn, just like me. When I turned into my neighborhood, everything looked exactly the same. The leafless maple tree, the white fence. The living room window is glowing with soft light, all of it peaceful, as if the world hadn't yet heard I had been fired for an FA violation. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. Rachel sat on the armchair, a half-finished green knitted scarf resting on her lap. She looked up when she heard the door. "You're home early." Such a simple sentence, but it made me want to sit on the floor and cry like a child. I forced a smile and slipped off my coat. The meeting ended early today. Rachel didn't ask anything else. She just looked at me one beat longer, long enough to tell me she knew something in my day had cracked. I was heading toward the kitchen when my phone started vibrating nonstop. I unlocked it, and messages flooded the screen like a broken dam. "Linda, are you all right?" "Raphael, we need to meet tonight." "Nora, they're calling back from Fort Carson." "Unknown number. FA needs verification of inspection procedures." I stood in the living room, staring at the glowing screen. So it wasn't over. They pushed me out the door, but the process was pulling me right back in. Rachel stood up. "Let me make you some hot chocolate." The exact same sentence she said 8 years ago when Mark died. I remembered sitting by that door too, hands shaking, not knowing what came next. Rachel placed a warm cup in my hands, then, like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Today was the same. The chocolate was still perfectly sweet, steaming, just warm enough to steady me. My phone rang again. This time it was a call. The screen showed the name, Carter Hayes. I answered. Carter was Marston's in-house counsel, always present in major meetings, but never someone who called me after hours. "Claire, I'm not calling on behalf of the company. I'm calling for you." I sat down and placed the cup on the table. "What is it?" Carter's voice dropped low. "I heard what happened this morning, and you need to listen carefully. Your contract has a special clause I doubt you reviewed closely." He was right. I had skimmed it. The clause about termination under hostile conditions. A hostile termination clause. If the company dismisses you in a way that damages your professional reputation in front of leadership, you're entitled to compensation, a very large one. I stared out the window, sunlight glinting on the front yard. How large? Carter didn't hesitate. Depending on severity, it could reach into the millions. And based on how he handled it today, that's very likely. Rachel handed me a tissue. I exhaled slowly, deeply. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want to sink with a terrible decision. And because I remember you saved the Fort Carson contract last month. If that shipment had failed, the company wouldn't even exist to fire anyone today. I could hear the honesty in his voice. Carter continued. There's something else. The FAA sent a request for independent verification about the shortened procedures Sienna proposed. They didn't send it to Grant. They sent it to legal, and they want to speak to you, not to Sienna. I closed my eyes. The pieces finally clicked. Sienna wanted speed. Grant wanted pretty numbers. And the FAA, the agency that could shut down an entire airport, wanted the truth. Carter spoke again. I can't officially represent you, but do three things. 1, don't sign anything from Marston. 2, hire a senior labor attorney outside the company. 3, keep every piece of evidence tied to the FAA procedures Sienna interfered with. Each instruction made the floor under my feet feel steadier. When the call ended, I put my phone down. Rachel was watching me with that quiet steadiness I had leaned on many times in my life. Is something wrong? She asked gently. I took a sip of chocolate, sweet, warm, and pulling me back to the place I needed to stand. The place of someone who does not surrender, I whispered. It looks like Grant just made the biggest mistake of his career. Rachel nodded, as if everything already made sense to her. And the clause you never thought about might just save you. I let out a tired laugh. Not hopeless anymore, just worn. Today felt like the sky collapsed on the part of my life called work. But when everything falls, something else opens. And in that opening, for the first time, I saw another path. A path without Grant, without Sienna, without those staged meetings. A path that began with 4 words, I'm not signing anything. And with the quiet faith of my sister, who set another cup of hot chocolate into my hands and said, You have far more left to do than they think. And for the first time all day, I believed it. That night, just when I thought I had earned a minute of peace with my cup of hot chocolate, there was a knock at the door. Not one knock, a whole group of them. When I opened it, 20 familiar faces stood on the porch like they had just made the most important decision of their lives. Sling bags, folding chairs, and someone even carrying a cardboard box. Raphael held a giant thermos like he was prepping for a 24-hour shift. Linda spoke first. We need a place to meet. The conference room on 18 is no longer for decent people, so we came here. I laughed for the first time that day, and it actually sounded real. I stepped aside. Come in, but I don't have enough chairs for everyone. Within minutes, my small living room turned into a temporary command center. The dining table became an analysis desk, the armchair became a meeting seat, and every outlet was claimed in 10 seconds. Rachel walked through the scene without asking a single question. She simply opened a cabinet, grabbed a pot of ginger tea, and asked who wanted some. It felt like the late nights running major operations, except this time, no one was doing it for a KPI. They were doing it for dignity. Linda handed me a notebook. We start here. No one mentioned Aerotech. No one said Grant or Sienna. We only listed what we still had: knowledge, procedures, contractor networks, and the integrity Aerotech had lost. Raphael opened a map of Denver and pointed at the area near Centennial Airport. If you want to rebuild, you should start around here. We're already used to the sound of jet engines. A rundown warehouse appeared on the map. Gray concrete walls, faded metal roof, a rusted sign. The rent was unbelievably cheap. Linda looked at me. At least it doesn't collapse. I nodded. Good. We'll see it tomorrow. The next morning, we all stood in front of the warehouse. When the metal door rolled up, the scraping noise sounded like the place had been retired for years. But inside it was wide, open, empty, and most importantly, no one could fire us from here. I turned a slow circle. This could be where we begin. Raphael grinned. Horizon Logistics. The name fits you. Horizon. The horizon line. I repeated it, feeling something hopeful in it. Linda added, and if the ceiling falls, it will only fall after hours. Don't worry. We laughed, a tired but honest kind of laugh. So the name stuck. Horizon Logistics. Our new office had two strengths. It was cheap and the ceiling usually stayed up. Usually. I said that, and Raphael added, except when the wind is strong. Just don't meet under that corner. We started cleaning. No complaints. No comparisons. Nora attacked the dust so aggressively, I half expected her to file a report claiming the dust had violated workplace standards. Raphael tested the electrical system. Only 40% of the outlets worked, but everyone considered that a victory. While we cleaned, I received a notification that the FAA had temporarily suspended a shipment at Aerotech because of missing inspection records. I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness for the people who stayed. But the truth only made me more certain. Horizon had to take another path. By noon, a dark blue SUV pulled up in front of the warehouse. A middle-aged man stepped out, leather jacket, sharp stride. He asked, "Who is Claire Whitmore?" I stepped forward. "That's me." He shook my hand. "I am Landon Pierce, 30 years in logistics investment, Dallas. I heard something interesting about your team." I looked at my 20 people dusting tables, sweeping floors, pulling wires, and I said, "What exactly did you hear?" He smiled. "I heard you refused to sign off on a shortened inspection protocol. I pay more attention to people with standards than to people with good speeches." He walked around the warehouse, studying everyone, every corner, every list we had scribbled on a temporary board. He didn't give a pity smile, didn't pretend to be impressed. He simply observed with the eyes of someone who had seen companies fail and companies rise from dirt floors. "Show me your plan," he said. We laid everything out: routes, procedures, order estimates, risks, costs, no glitter, no unrealistic promises. I told him plainly, we don't cut corners. We don't trade safety for fake speed. If you want that kind of operation, you're talking to the wrong people. He thought for a few seconds, then nodded. Good. I never invest in people who lack principles. He pulled out a small notebook, wrote something down, and handed me a slip of paper. This is your starting investment, $150,000. If you do what you say you will in the first month, I will put in more. My face stayed calm, but my heart lost its composure instantly. I folded the paper. Thank you. But I need to be clear, we don't change our principles for capital. Landon laughed. If you did, I'd already be back in my SUV. He left, carrying the smell of leather from his jacket and the sense that he had just opened a window we never thought we'd have. The whole team stood still for a moment, then exhaled all at once. Raphael stepped beside me. We're officially taking off now, right? I looked at the old warehouse, at the sunlight leaking through the holes in the roof, at the people who had no proper desks but had more conviction than steel. No, I said. We're not taking off. We're just rolling out of the gate. The runway is long, but this time, we're the ones at the controls. That morning, while Horizon was trying to get the network running in our new warehouse, Nora turned her laptop screen toward me. You should see this. On one of Colorado's major news sites was a photo of Sienna behind a press podium. The Marston Aerotech logo glowed behind her, and beneath it ran the headline, Marston addresses safety protocol controversy. I opened the video. Sienna appeared in a deep blue suit, hair pulled tight, voice calm and polished, like she was presenting a marketing campaign instead of handling a crisis. She talked about differences in understanding FAA procedures and certain individuals who left because they did not align with a culture of innovation. She did not say my name, but when she referred to someone as overly conservative in applying standards, I knew exactly who she meant. Linda stood beside me and shook her head. That is not a misunderstanding of the process. That is not understanding anything at all. I turned off the video, not angry, just amazed at how cleanly Sienna redirected the blame. But that was only the beginning. By noon, I received an email from a New York law firm. Legal notice, Horizon Logistics. The tone was stiff. Marston expressed concern about unfair competition and warned that they would pursue legal action if Horizon continued creating market confusion. Rachel was watering plants nearby and asked, Why do you look like you just saw a ghost? I forwarded the email to the attorney Carter had recommended. A few minutes later, he called back, his voice steady like someone who had seen these intimidation tactics too many times. They are probing. As long as you did not take proprietary data from Aerotech, they have no case. They just want to see if you panic. I looked up at the warehouse roof. One sheet of metal was slightly misaligned, but it was still holding. Horizon would too. I was not about to let them scare us. But the next move came faster than I expected. Harold, the Aerotech board member, began calling defense contractors. I did not hear it directly, but the industry is small. That afternoon, Richard from Fort Carson called. Claire, I still support you, but Harold is pushing to keep the contract with Aerotech. I want you to know we are under pressure, I answered quietly. Do what you feel is safe. I will not put anyone in a difficult position. A few civilian clients also emailed, saying they were pausing negotiations to avoid legal risks. No one doubted our abilities. They were simply afraid of getting caught in a fight they did not fully understand. In the warehouse, keyboards kept tapping, but now there were worried glances toward the financial board. Horizon was operational, but it was clear we were being attacked from every side. That evening, while I reviewed insurance contracts, my phone rang. A professional female voice came on. We are calling from Morning, Colorado. We would like to invite you to speak about FAA procedures and the current landscape of the aerospace industry. I knew, what that meant. If I accepted, I would be stepping into the same arena Sienna had just used to shape her narrative, the media. But it was also the one place I could tell the truth without firing shots. What are the conditions? I asked. No names, no companies, just the procedures. No turning it into a feud. The main audience is people over 60. They value clarity. I agreed. The next morning, the studio lights were bright and warm. The host, a woman in her 50s, introduced me with a voice as gentle as an autumn morning. She asked, Many places are trying to streamline safety procedures lately. How do you see this trend? I spoke slowly, clearly, without attacking anyone. I described the FAA as the final barrier between a small error and a major accident. I explained why every inspection step exists. I shared stories of shipments that had to be halted because a single number was off. The host asked, Why do companies want to cut steps? Because on paper, removing a check can save a few hours, but in reality, it shortens the distance to a courtroom hearing. I looked straight into the camera. Anyone who has seen an FAA investigation knows that is not an exaggeration. Her final question was, Have you ever had to choose between your principles and your job? Yes. I lost my job because I chose my principles. But if I had compromised that day, every future accident would have made me wonder whether the root cause started with the shortcut I allowed. The studio fell silent for a moment. The host smiled softly, then shifted to Horizon. Why start again? What is different from Aerotech? I answered simply. Because I want my team to be allowed to say no when something is dangerous. And at Horizon, the person explaining FAA procedures must be someone who actually understands them, not someone who looks good under studio lights. When filming ended, the host held my hand. Thank you for not turning this into a battleground. Older viewers will appreciate the way you spoke. When I returned to the warehouse, my phone was full of messages. Clients who had paused negotiations wrote, Saw you this morning. We want to resume talks. Your explanation was clear. We trust Horizon. Richard from Fort Carson called again. My superiors watched it. They sent me one sentence. Working with someone who understands the FAA is better than working with someone who understands media. The contract hold is lifted. Not every client came back, but enough to show we were headed in the right direction. Later that afternoon, Nora turned on a financial broadcast. The screen is split into two. On one side, Sienna talked vaguely about absolute safety commitment. On the other hand, I was drawing the FA chart on a whiteboard in the studio. The commentator concluded, one side talks image, one side talks procedure. Who will the market remember? I did not know what Grant and Sienna were doing on the 55th floor at that moment. But from our old warehouse near the airport, I knew they had just lost something crucial: the power to control the story. And when the powerful lose control of the narrative, the real fight is only beginning. That morning, while Horizon was running its first test shipment, Nora came running from the back of the warehouse, out of breath, but with a look that told me something serious had just dropped. You need to see this. The FAA just released the report. I opened the link she sent. The first line hit like an explosion. Inspection procedures were shortened illegally, approved by Sienna Marston. No gray area, no confusion, no suggestion, a signed approval. Linda stood nearby and shook her head. She dug that hole way too deep. I said nothing. No satisfaction, no bitterness. Just the steady feeling of truth finally landing exactly where it belonged. 2 hours later, Carter called. The board is in an emergency meeting. With this report, Grant is almost certain to lose his position. I looked up at the patched, dusty warehouse roof. Fragile as it was, the integrity under it stood firmer than the entire company on the 55th floor. By afternoon, the official announcement broke through every Colorado news station. CEO Grant Marston steps down for health reasons. The anchor emphasized the words health reasons the way people do when everyone knows it is the excuse chosen to avoid telling the real story. A clip played. Grant walking out of the press room, face pale, tie crooked. He looked like a man fleeing a fire he had started himself. But the news did not stop there. The next morning, the FAA issued its follow-up decision. Sienna Marston was barred from holding any management position in aerospace logistics for 5 years. Linda burst out laughing. For someone in public relations, 5 years is basically an entire career. That same afternoon, Harold appeared on the news. The man who once championed Sienna in every meeting. And yet today, he said the line people like him use when they decide who will sink and who will float. I trusted the wrong person. I had not even finished reacting to that interview when my phone rang. Unknown number. I knew immediately who it was. I answered, Claire. It is me, Grant. His voice was so drained I thought I was speaking to someone else. I could hear wind in the background, footsteps on pavement, like he was standing in a parking lot far from anyone who might recognize him. I am calling to apologize. I was wrong. I let things go too far. I sat on the edge of a makeshift table in the warehouse. Sometimes what ends a chapter is simply the truth finally surfacing, leaving no space to hide. So you want me to come back? He stayed silent for a long time. If you want, the board can reconsider. The company needs stability. I inhaled slowly. Grant, I am not going back to a place I no longer belong. He exhaled, heavy, as if accepting a reality he had tried hard not to face. I wished him luck and ended the call. No anger, no satisfaction, just the feeling of a door closing without needing to be pulled shut. When I walked back inside, Nora asked, So he really apologized? I nodded. And you are not happy at all, I answered. Because it is already over. An ending is an ending. But the truth was not done. It still had one more turn. By early evening, financial news stations reported Marston Aerotech stock falling another 10%. Investors questioned leadership. One paper wrote that this was the consequence of an irresponsible executive culture. A company that once stood in the sky was now struggling to find a landing strip and horizon. That afternoon, Landon arrived at the warehouse holding a new stack of documents. I think it is time to update your valuation. He placed the folder in front of me. I opened to the first page and had to look twice. Horizon Logistics is valued at $50 million, Linda shouted. Raphael clutched his head, and Nora cried immediately. The warehouse that people joked might collapse, suddenly filled with laughter and relief. A room that once felt like it might lose its ceiling now held hope instead. I looked at them and felt something I had never named before. These people did not follow me for a title or a flashy promise. They followed because they trusted I would never let them be treated as replaceable. Nora tugged my sleeve. Say something. I looked at the team and said, if they wanted me to fall apart, they should not have let me walk out with my dignity intact. The whole warehouse burst into laughter. That night, Rachel and I sat on the front porch. She asked what I thought about everything that had happened. I looked toward the horizon, where the lights of Centennial Airport blinked like a river that never stops moving. I think this is not the fall of the Marston Empire. This is just the moment they finally see the consequences of what they chose. Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder. And horizon, I answered. Horizon is only beginning, but it is built on the right thing. I knew, without having to say it, that I had walked out of one door, and my life started breathing again the moment I did. The Marston Empire had fallen, and I had not. Everyone could see that. The New Horizon headquarters was only 3 blocks from the old warehouse, yet walking inside felt like stepping into an entirely different chapter. No more old paint, no more flickering lights, no more wind slipping through warped metal sheets. It was an open, bright space with new wooden floors still smelling of pine resin, tall glass panels catching the sunlight like they were holding the centennial horizon itself. That afternoon, we held our first full company meeting in the new building. I watched everyone move around with purpose, adjusting the digital board, adding chairs, and setting up the projector. Someone joked we were preparing for a wedding. In a way, we were. It was the day all of us stepped into a different life. Nora started the meeting by inviting the first 20 people of Horizon to come forward. They stood in a line, each completely different, but sharing one thing. They were the ones who stood up the moment I walked out of the 55th floor conference room. Each of them received a small commemorative card, not because of the item itself, but because it marked what we all knew. They chose what was right even when they had no idea what tomorrow would look like. Linda cried as she accepted her card. She said she had worked in the industry for 40 years, and this was the first time she truly felt respected for the work she put in. Raphael laughed, but I saw his hand trembling around the card. He once told me he followed not because of me, but because he wanted his son to grow up knowing adults also have the right to say no. Sarah said that the day she left Marston, she did not know whether she was stepping into a future or into unemployment. But during her first week at Horizon, she slept better than she had in an entire year. I looked at each of their faces. The old folding chairs from our garage meetings were still stacked in the corner, a quiet reminder that we did not start with wealth, but with resolve. When everyone settled, I walked to the front, looking out at the room glowing under the lights. I had not written a speech. I never believed in polished paragraphs. I spoke with my normal voice. What happened to me at Marston took 5 minutes. 5 minutes to erase 6 years of work. But those 5 minutes did not break me. The room fell silent. No one moved. I continued. People can hurt you in 5 minutes. They can take a title, a desk, a version of who you thought you were. But how you rise after those 5 minutes decides the rest of your life. I looked at the front row where Horizon's first 20 were sitting. They did not look away. We are the proof. If they fail to see your value, that is not your fault. If they think the company is a castle and you are just the gardener, let them think it. Castles crumble. Gardeners know exactly where to plant next. A few quiet laughs, but the kind that comes from people who had once stood in rooms where their worth went unseen. The meeting shifted into its final part when Nora handed me a new folder. I opened it and saw the logo of a major international contractor with a line I had long hoped to see. Official contract. One of the contracts Marston spent 2 years negotiating, yet never secured. Horizon landed it in 3 weeks. When I announced it, the room erupted in applause. Not the loud kind, the meaningful kind. The kind that told me everyone in that room believed in what we were building. Horizon would change their lives, and maybe the entire logistics field. I waited for the room to settle and spoke again. There was a time when I thought I belonged to the place I left behind, but now I know exactly where I belong. Here, with people who chose to stand when everything told them to kneel. I looked across the bright room, at the solid ceiling, at the hopeful faces. They were quiet, not because of formality, but because they understood what I was saying. This was something everyone eventually faces in their life. The decision between dignity and endurance. I ended with this. If 5 minutes knock you down, stand up in a way they will never forget. Life is not measured by how many times you get hit, but by the moment you walk away from a place you no longer belong. I stepped down, and the entire room stood to applaud, not for me, for themselves. People who were steady but never weak, quiet but never defeated. Before the meeting ended, I added one more line. If this story reminds you of the moment you chose dignity over endurance, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to tell about people who turned 5 painful minutes into an entirely new life. The meeting closed in the light of a new day. And I knew that from now on, our path would never again be dictated by a conference room on the 55th floor.